Good morning, everyone. So my name is Monai, and I will be present on what is design thinking, an in-depth overview of the design thinking process. So for the agenda of the webinar, we'll start with the housekeeping, and then I'll give you a bit brief overview about Altis. Then next, I will go to the content that has two sections. The first one is the overview of the design thinking on their definitions and how it is important, why do we need it. And then we'll go to the in-depth of the design thinking process. And if you have any questions, like we also have a separate Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So for the housekeeping, today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 45 minutes, including Q&A. And you will get the slides and access to the webinar recording from the Altis webinar team via email. And if you have any questions about the webinar and the design thinking that as I presenting here, you can submit via Zoom Q&A section screen down below when you join the Zoom, but note that we will answer those questions at the Q&A part of the webinar. And if you want to learn more about the design thinking and would like to know or get some recommended resources and reference that are used in the slide, they are all at the references section of the slides. So a bit introduction about the Altis. So Altis is the Australia and New Zealand's largest privately owned data analytics consultant. It has been run for more than 20 years now, and it has several offices across Australia, New Zealand, and United Kingdom. So besides the data and analytic consulting, we also provide training as well. And we also have the design thinking with data workshop too. So if you're interested in that workshop, I'll leave you the connect page at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's get started to the topic. So before we go to the design thinking, I would like to use the quote definition of the design thinking from Tim Brown, the chair of IDEATE. So in case that you're not familiar with what IDEATE company is, so IDEATE is a global consultancy firm in design that they provide services for their clients. And so by definition by Tim Brown, the design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibility of technology, and the requirements for the business success. So why is it important? Well, the design thinking is important because it is a process that helps us design a desirable product or solution. And if you see the picture on the right here is the Venn diagram components, what it needs to be to consider as innovation. So in the Venn diagram, you notice that innovations require three parts to be considered as innovation. The first part is the human's perspective or desirability. The second part is the business or viability. For example, it is cost effective. And for the third aspect is the technical or feasibility, which you can consider as how possible that this can be done in science or technology perspective or with the current knowledge we have. So you might notice some of the product or solution, they have the latest technology and it is cost effective, but somehow it doesn't get a good market or no one buys it. The reason behind that phenomenon is somehow their product or solution is lacking desirability. And usually most of the product might missing this part easily, because when the producers or the team has spent a lot of time to design or produce, they already get the idea behind it, but with the larger audience, they might missing that, or the users might not have the same knowledge or the background as the team do. So the design thinking is also try to bring us back to put more attention to the desirability part. And that's how the successful product requires innovation to become successful, and in all those parts as well. So next, I would like to go to the depth of the design thinking. I would like to first list all the 5 stages in the design thinking. So you can see in the right-hand side picture here, the flow chart that I put in the slides, you notice that the process consists of 5 stages. There are empathize stage, define stage, IDEATE stage, prototype stage, and test stage. So you will notice that from the flowchart itself, so it might look like is the step-by-step process, but actually it's a non-linear process. And you can see each stage are related to the other stage. For example, the prototype step itself might spark new ideas and feedback to the idea state. The test stage itself is also create new ideas for the project, as well as you test more with the users. Or also the test stage as well, it can also reveal more details about the users. So you understand the users more when they actually interact with your product or solution, and sometimes make you realize that maybe the problems that we try to looking for might be different from what we thought in the beginning, or it also validates your idea that, oh, actually this is the right problem that we are trying to fix. So the first stage of the design thinking is empathize. So the empathize stage goal is to understand your users' needs thoroughly. In terms of users' needs, you can break down into 2 groups of them. The first part is the external needs that you can see clearly by observing them. These are what they are saying, what they're doing. Whereas if it's the internal needs, this part is the tricky one, because you don't know what they are actually thinking or feeling or experiencing unless you tell them, or you interpret further by their behavior. So this is why we need some tools to guide us through the users or humans' behavior. So I would recommend 2 tools in this empathize stage. The first one is the empathy map that you can see an example of the empathy map to the top picture on the right-hand side here, that lists all the activities that user says, does, thinks, or feel. And then you can analyze further and then list down at the needs section here. And then after you analyze all these input, you can also take notes on what are the key hidden message or hidden findings that you've processed further. And these insights will be fed into the define stage that I will talking to next. And for the Maslow hierarchy of needs here, you know, this one is the is the psychology term on how to categorize the needs into different levels. So for the basic needs is usually what you need to help you survive. Psychological needs are what needs that you need to make you happy or have a good mental health. And in terms of the self-fulfillment needs, I would say there are the needs that when you get these needs, you will get your full potentials, or like in other words, is the best version of yourself. So to make it more clearer example, because like the process itself is non-linear and sometimes it's quite hard to understand if you don't have the practical example. So I would like to use one of our product example is the Giving Analytics. And in particular, I would like to point out or share the experience of the design development of the feature called the best donor segment. And so in the empathize stage here, the stories of this feature starting from one of our Giving Analytics products customers, they send us a request for new feature that helps them to understand their donor demographics. So what do we start from get their feedback is we have a conversation with them, have a meeting with them, and ask them further on like what are they usually do to complete their work, like what do they do with the donor demographic data or details. And then we list them all and try to understand like what are they actually trying to achieve. And from our conversation and meeting with them, we also do some requirement analysis, and we found out that actually they wanted to use or the donors demographic to use in terms of find out what is the best group or best performing donors that they should be focused on. And the next part that they would like to use from the donor demographic as well, they want to see how each of the donor groups are progressing over time. Like for example, some group might have a good starting at the starting of the donation, but then later on they tend to have their performance decrease, or vice versa. Then we found that when we talk to another client as well in our product, we found that they also use different definitions or different type on how they group the donors. So when we collect all this information, the next part of the design thinking process is the define. So the goal of the define stage is to define a meaningful and actionable problem statement. But also this is the most challenging part of the process, because sometimes when we go through all the process, we don't actually know what is the problem we are trying to solve. So you might have to revisit this definition every now and then. But also, it's also the most important part as well, because if you get the right problem statement early on, it will also help your team progressing on the right track. Whereas if you don't get a clear problem statement, it will keep you off the right track. So the definition of the good problem statement is the problem statement that is human-centered or focused on your users. But also, it should have the right amount of the scope. In other words, the scope of the problem statement should be broad enough to be creative so that you don't fix into one side of view and you will be able to think out of the box. But it should be narrow enough to become manageable. Otherwise, the scope is too big and then we don't know how to tackle it. So back to the previous part, the define stage. The example for the best donor segment features is after we get the requirements from the users and we analyze further that they need to find out who is the best group of donor who perform well and what are their donation performance progressing over the time. We also group all the requirements into the problem statement is we want to create a page or the visualization that make our user easy to understand and find out what is the best performing groups of donors and also be able to tell them how each group of donor are progressing over the time. And the extra requirement that we add here in the definition is the users can also have their own group definition of their donor segmentation. So they can use the group of the donors by applying their own filters. Then the next stage is the IDEATE stage. So this stage is the goal is to generate lots of ideas into the forms of questions and solutions, and then cutting down into the best and most practical idea. Usually this step will overlap with the define stage because sometimes you have to go back and forth between the problem definition and then you put them into some ideas and then you try to validate the idea whether it's actually solves the problem or is actually something else. And for this method, you can use some tools such as the brainstorm or mind mapping. So for the pictures on the right is an example of the template to ask how might we questions to figure out what is the problem. Like we already know the problem, but we try to brainstorm the ideas on what are the ways or the options that we could do to solve the problem. So this template is from the Stanford School of Design that they usually use for their design students to go through their design thinking process. And back to the practical example. So for our case, we will have a brainstorm. We use the brainstorm method. For example, we have a team meeting that gather all of our team members, and then we try to brainstorm and list out the idea of the solution or the design of the data visualization charts as much as possible. And then we filter out to the one that all team members are agree on that is the best and the most practical idea. Then the next stage, the fourth one, is the prototype. So the prototype stage is their goal is to producing an early, inexpensive, and scaled down version of the product or feature. The goal itself is to test out and reveal any problems with the idea or the design at the test stage that I will be talking next after this part. And there are two types of the prototypes called low fidelity and high fidelity. So for the example here, there are two pictures here that I I got it from the Adobe Design Blocking experience. So the top one is their low fidelity prototype here that usually they're done in the paper sketch. Sometimes you call it paper prototype. And the second part, the bottom picture of the screen is the high fidelity prototype. So for example, this one, they have the very detailed user graphic interfaces. And this one usually be done by the design application, or some developers might prefer to have the minimum users interface by using the actual framework that they will be developing. So for the prototype guidelines, I would recommend that you just start building straight away and don't spend too much time on it, because you never know whether this type of design or the approach will be using at the end of the final product. And as long as you design the prototype, make sure you remember your testing goal as well on what are you trying to test the user. And when you build the prototype, just make sure that you have your user's perspective in mind. So in the practical example, so after we get the final design here, in our first iteration, we'll start with the paper prototype first. And I'll tell you why in the next slide. And then after that, we will start building more fidelity prototype as more iterations going on. And in the later iteration, we using the actual development framework that we use to develop the application. So you might be asking, what are the key difference or the uses between the low fidelity and high fidelity? So for the low fidelity itself, the pros is it is quick and low cost, and also have a minimum time and effort, because if you do it from the paper, you can just draw, and if you don't like it, you can just draw a new one or override something on top of it. The cons of the low fidelity type is it has lack of realism, because sometimes when you draft it, you don't draft them like that what will exactly look like in the end. But the idea is to convey the principal concept, or like the high level concept of the interface on, for example, what the layout will look like. And sometimes it might not be appropriate for target users as well. For example, of this part is if your target users have visual impairment and then you use the paper prototype, you might find a hard time for them to understand the prototype. And when comparing to the high fidelity, the pros is they are more engaging and more accurate usability testing result, because it will look as similar as what you will produce at the end of the design process. But the cons as well is because since you already put a lot of effort to build and make it work, it also make you have or your team more resistant on making changes as well. So which is why we start with the low fidelity prototype first, and then later on, after we are quite confident with our design, then we move more towards to the high fidelity product. So the example of the high fidelity product, besides using design software, You can also use a 3D plastic model as well. And the final stage of the design thinking is testing. So the testing goal is to testing the solution or the product design that you implement using the current design. The key is to make sure that your design concept actually fits or address the target user's problem. Sometimes if you are from the UX UI design background, you might notice that this stage, sometimes called usability testing. And the usability testing itself is usually undertaken in concurrent with the prototype stage, because sometimes you want to get the feedback straight away when you start developing your product. And there are three main types of testing here. There are formal testing, informal testing, and remote testing. I'll give you the practical example at the end of when I go through each type of the testing. So the first part is the formal testing. The formal testing will use an actual research facility that has a complete one-way mirror and with a high fidelity prototype. So if you notice the pictures on the right here, you'll see that these windows here, they're actually a one-way mirror. So the team will be able to see the user or the tester here inside the room. And you notice that the room, they only have two people. The user who will perform the test itself, and the facilitator that will explain the process or the tasks that the users that needs to be done. And then you notice that the team, these two outside here, they are observing. So since it's the one-way mirror, so the facilitator and the user here could not see anything happen outside here. So it is like a virtual environment that the team can actually witness their user interacting with their product. However, this type of testing is very expensive and not suitable if you have a tight budget, because you need like a specific facility that have all these things, and you have to put a lot of effort to build a high fidelity prototype as well. So for this type of testing, it is usually best for the large organizations that are heavily invested in the project already. For example, this picture is, I got this picture from the booking.com, their design blog post. So this is their dedicated research facility in Amsterdam. So since they already have the website up and running, so they want to keep improving their users experience. And so they already invest the project a lot already. So for them, it is worthwhile to actually have their own research facility to have a continuous testing. So the second type of the testing is the informal testing. This type of testing usually occur in the meeting room, consists of the user, the facilitator, and the analyst. And this is also quite the popular option because it has the balance between the cost and the in-person testing. However, because it's quite informal and have a limited group of people getting involved, so sometimes it is not possible for all stakeholders to witness the live session. So the stakeholder will not be able to witness the live session here. They might get the summary or the report later from the team member. However, this is the best type of testing for a project that still require in-person testing, but you have a limited budget. And the last part is the remote testing. So the remote testing is using a video conference software, for example, Zoom, WebEx, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, etc. And all participants can join from the location of their choice. Everyone uses the computer and setup that they're familiar with, including those with special needs. However, sometimes you might is quite prone to expose to technical difficulties, such as connectivity glitch, poor network connection, etc. So back to the practical example, in our case, we decided to use remote testing with 3 reasons. The first one is because our product is a web application that can be accessed from anywhere. The second reason is because our clients already have a technological literacy to use the video conference software efficiently. So we will have a good time an easier time to setting up a meeting to go through the usability testing with them. And the third part that I find is quite important for remote testing as well is because we already established a trust and relationship with our clients early on. So it is quite easier for us to do the remote testing with them. Whereas if you still are quite new with your customer or user, you might need to go to the informal testing approach to build a relationship with your users first. So for the test plan guidelines, make sure that you let your users compare alternatives. This can be the competitor's product or design, or you list multiple types of the interface and then let the user choose. Because sometimes the user doesn't know what is a good design until you have some competitors or the alternatives that they can pick on. For example, if you give them one type of the design, and then the user just tells you that they don't like it, but the part that might be difficult is when you ask them further questions that, so if you don't like this design, which type of design you would prefer, then they couldn't answer. But if you give them like multiple options here, then they will see clearly on which design they like most and why. And next part of the guideline is let users experience the prototype. Show them the prototype itself and see how they interact, but don't tell them the detail step or the instructions. Because the goal here is if we want to make the product or the solution easy to use, then they should be able to intuitively thinking and get the idea on how to use the product with the minimum instructions. Then you also ask the users to talk through their experience as well. So this process is called think aloud. So what they do is, as the user saw the screen or saw the user's interface, like they have to tell the facilitator what was exactly what they were thinking and what are their thoughts during that time. And when they see the interaction of the app, what do they feel? These techniques help the facilitator and the analyst to understand the user's internal needs. And then you also have to observe the user behavior as well, because sometimes what they say that they're feeling this way or they're thinking this way, they might do something different. So you have to make sure you observe all point of view of the user's behavior. And the last part is quite important, is to ask the users follow-up questions. This type of questions can be the validations on the user explanation. For example, to clarify what do they mean when they saying particular type of word, or you ask them further that, are you understand their thought correctly? And if so, why they think that way? These will be the important input to feed back to the empathize stage and the define stage. Then some of you might have the questions that since the usability testing is so important, but we have a limited budget, how many tests should I run then? So I would like to share you some interesting research, which is a collaboration research between the human-computer interaction, or other words, HCI, with the psychologist. So Jacob Newson is a HCI scientist, whereas Tom Landauer is the psychologist. So they're both working together to research on the coverage of the problems in terms of the usability that they find compared to the number of the test user that they run throughout the stage. So you can see the chart here. This chart is the logarithmic scale. You notice that the relationship is the logarithmic scale between the coverage of the problems that you found during the testing compared to the size of the test user. So the key takeaway of the research, if you don't want to go through all the research paper, is you should test no more than 5 users, because like if it's more than that, it's not much significant problem finding, because like usually for example, this one, let's say 5 people here, I would say the plot will be around here. Let's say it might cover 80%. Then usually this 80% that you found during the testing, it will be already covered the significant design flaws. So the rest of the 20% that are hidden along the way, it will be like the small design fault that might not be as important as the first 80%. And if you want the accurate result, usually run more tests to give you more result. So if you have the limited budget, their recommendation is each testing, you don't have more than 5 users, but you run the test as many as you can afford. So we are almost at the end of the presentation. So if you could not remember all the content here, I would like to give you one sentence as a takeaway of this presentation. So I noticed that as I use the design thinking at work for almost of our product here, I find that every time I follow the process, it always goes back to the one big question, which is, does your solution solve the user's pain point? And then the design thinking will help you to have a methodological process to follow to the end of your design. So, and this page will be the reference and the recommendation of the resource if you want to study further about the design thinking process. So you might notice that the content is the mixture between the design, which sometimes might call industrial design or the human computer interaction for the IT area, and also with the small part of the psychology involved, because they want to understand what the users were thinking. And now we go to the question. Right, I got a question. Okay. So the question was, do you have any other tips on how to improve informal and remote testing to improve the result as compared to formal testing process? I would say this is a very good question, because as you know, as you experience what happened last year with the pandemic, so I think you might have to being forced to do a lot of more remote testing. So I'll break down into two parts. So for the informal part of the testing, usually what you notice is the key users will be the facilitator, because the facilitator will have to explain the user on what they need to perform, what the process will look like. And then the facilitator will also have to ask questions to clarify the users better on what the users are actually thinking, and what were they feeling at the time of the testing. So in terms of the testing with the informal, usually for the face-to-face meetings, like for some type of user, you might notice that each person have different personalities, and sometimes if it's the first met, you might probably have to break the ice, have to have some break the ice conversation to make the user, the testing user, feel as much as comfortable that they could do. And that is the reason behind this one as well, because if the user themselves are not comfortable to share their thoughts, then you might miss some key important information, because well, it is quite a tricky one when you have to share what you actually think and what you actually feel to a stranger. So if you don't build that trust early on before starting the test, then they might not tell you everything. So that's the part for both informal and remote testing. And for the remote testing part, I would suggest that before doing the testing, usually the most common problem is the technical difficulties. So this can be multiple reasons. They can be like the internet is bad, or if the user is not, or any participant is not familiar with the video recording tools or the video conference tool. So the tips will be, first one is picking the tools that everyone are most familiar with. So for example, if your organization already use Microsoft Office or Microsoft product, they might be more familiar with Microsoft Teams comparing to Zoom or Google Meet. But vice versa, if your organization are using Google Office, the Google Office Enterprise product, they might more, or if they are using Gmail in general, they might be more familiar with Google Meet. So make sure that you pick the application that everyone are most familiar with, to to prevent the possibilities of the technical difficulties. For example, if they find a hard time to share the screen, to interact with the rest of the team, for example. And then for next tip for the remote testing is the internet connection. So I would suggest make sure that if you join the session, sometimes you might notice that some of your apps are actually running on the background and use a lot of the network bandwidth, and then they kind of slow down the internet connection. And because it's the video conference, sometimes it's quite sensitive if you see that the user interactions is lacking, and then you miss some of the users' behavior during the test session. And then the next question is, how often can you circle back to a previous step in the process? For example, do you go back to EMPATHISE after prototyping? Or is that only if you find a major issue, meaning that you haven't understood the problem correctly? So, okay, let me share the screen back to the prototype one. Oh, sorry, not the prototype one, the flow chart one. So if you see the chart here for the prototype, so when after the prototype, usually it will come with the testing, and sometimes, as I already explained, that these two are come at the same time in parallel sometimes. So when you're testing, you will notice that you get the input from the users on their behavior, and usually when you find anything happen at the testing stage, you will log the issues here. That the analyst will log the issue, and then they pass this one back to the team to get a discussion on what they will do to address the issue. So at this part, it depends on how much effort you want to fix all the design problems, because I understand that sometimes you have the limited budget and then you cannot go through all the design issues. So if you have to pick some design fault to be fixed, then you have to prioritize which one is the highest to be fixed. So I'll say again, this is depend on your budget as well. So, yep, I think I answered the question. So I'll give few more time for people if they have some questions. So since no one have posed any question yet, so I would like to wrap up the presentation. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar and asking the question. So if you are interested in the Altis design thinking with data workshop, feel free to connect or contact the team here. So I'll leave this slide at the end of the webinar. So thank you everyone and have a good day.